My name is Helen Carter. I'm 68 years old, a widow, and I have spent most of my life balancing books for other people. Numbers have always made sense to me. People, not so much. That morning in the bank, with the fluorescent lights buzzing above my head and my daughter's hand gripping my elbow too tightly, I realized I was no longer being treated as a person, but as a signature waiting to be stolen. Emily leaned close, her voice syrupy but sharp enough to cut. "Mom, just sign it. It's all routine. Everyone your age does this." On my other side, Brian's presence pressed down like a weight. His hand landed on my shoulder, steady on the surface, but heavy in a way that said I had no choice. I felt my breath catch. I had known this moment was coming, though I prayed I was wrong. For months, I had felt the slow tightening of invisible strings, suggestions about retirement homes, warnings about scams, quiet whispers to relatives that I was slipping. They thought they had built a perfect trap. Maybe they believed age had dulled me. They had no idea how long I had been preparing for this very hour. When the bank manager slid the paperwork across the desk, my hand trembled, not with weakness, but with the effort of hiding the note I had folded into my palm. The pen scratched across the paper as if I were signing, but when I pushed the document back, I also slid the tiny slip of lined paper toward her. Help? Not my choice. Her eyes flicked down, then back to me. No words, just the slightest nod. She straightened, smoothed her jacket, and with calm authority turned the lock on the office door. The sound of that click echoed in my chest louder than any gavel. I felt both terrified and alive. This was no longer their game. It was mine. And from that moment forward, nothing in my life or theirs would ever be the same again. Emily's voice used to sing when she spoke to me. That Sunday after church, it tapped like a hammer. "Mom, I'll drive," she said, already sliding my keys into her purse. I didn't fight. I just watched them disappear and felt something lock inside me. At the grocery store, she hovered over the card reader. "Let me," she insisted before I could press my pin. Brian joined us outside, smiling in a way that never touched his eyes. He loaded the bags, kept the receipt, and said, "I'll file this." As though my house had quietly become his office. That evening, he sat at my table, sorting my pill organizer. His ring tapped against the plastic while I rinsed dishes, pretending not to notice. When the house quieted, I checked under the stove light. Tuesday's pill sat in Monday's slot, vitamins missing, tiny mistakes or tiny signals. I wrote them down in a steno pad I hid in the bread drawer. Keys taken, pin blocked, pills shifted. Numbers and notes steadied me. A week later, Emily laid a glossy brochure beside my coffee. A retirement community 20 miles away. Koi ponds. Women my age laughing under trimmed hedges. "Just options," she said. "You'd have more friends there. They show movies." Her glance slid to the hallway where photos of birthdays, graduations, and her father's portrait lined the wall, as if my life here was already too heavy for her. "I have friends," I answered softly. It was true, and it needed to be said. Later that day, I drove myself to the pharmacy and asked for a printout of my refills. The clerk asked if I was all right. "I'm fine," I replied, tucking the paper into my purse. Preparation never hurt. That night, Brian suggested I add him to my checking account for emergencies. I smiled and said I'd think about it. After he left, I wrapped the steno pad in foil and slid it into the freezer. If they searched, they'd mistake it for meat. What I needed most was time. The following weeks felt like walking across ice that cracked beneath every step. Emily began showing up with articles clipped from magazines about elder fraud and memory decline. She laid them on my kitchen counter as if they were warnings tailored for me. "We just don't want you to be taken advantage of," she said. Her smile stretched too thin. Brian grew bolder. He asked me to consider a durable power of attorney, explaining it like a gift. "It'll protect you," he assured, sliding a sample form across my table. His finger tapped the signature line as if it were already mine. I kept my expression calm, nodding like someone grateful, while my heart pressed against my ribs. Their whispers reached the family. A cousin called to ask gently if I was doing okay. Emily must have painted me as fragile, confused. I bit down the sting of betrayal, thanked my cousin for caring, and hung up. The manipulation turned subtle and constant. Emily offered to balance my checkbook, something I had done with steady hands for 4 decades. Brian began driving me to appointments I hadn't asked him to attend, waiting in lobbies like a shadow. Each small act could be explained as kindness. Together, they built a net they thought I couldn't see. But I saw everything, and I kept writing in my hidden pad. Magazine clipping, POA form, family whispers, checkbook offer, shadow at doctor's office. My notes grew like a second spine, keeping me upright. One evening, Emily cornered me with a soft voice that felt rehearsed. "Mom, you could give yourself peace of mind by adding Brian to your account. Just one signature." She placed a pen on the table between us. I looked at it as if it were a snake. "I'll sleep on it," I told her, rising to pour tea I didn't want. The cup rattled on its saucer as my hands shook, not from weakness, but from rage I refused to show. That night, I sat in bed with the lamp burning low, staring at the ceiling fan as it cut the air. I knew the bank visit was coming. The question wasn't if, it was when. The morning they said we were going to handle a few papers, I dressed carefully, choosing my navy cardigan and polishing the sensible shoes my husband once admired. I wanted to look steady, not frail. Emily complimented me with a brightness that felt rehearsed, then guided me toward the car. Brian drove, his hand firm on the wheel, his silence thick as tar. The bank smelled of coffee and printer ink. A young teller smiled politely before leading us into the office of Mrs. Foster, the branch manager. She was a woman near my age, sharp eyes softened by kindness. She introduced herself, shook our hands, and began sliding the documents across the polished desk. Brian leaned close, pointing to each signature line as if I couldn't read. Emily touched my arm, her voice light. "Mom, this is just to make sure bills are paid smoothly. Nothing scary." My pen felt heavy in my fingers. I had prepared for this moment. The night before. I tore a sheet from my steno pad and folded it small enough to hide beneath my palm. As I reached for the paperwork, I pressed the note onto the desk, just beneath Mrs. Foster's fingers. My hand trembled, but my eyes held hers. She glanced down, read the words, "Help, not my choice," and in that instant her gaze sharpened. She adjusted her glasses, nodded almost imperceptibly, and tucked the slip beneath her folder. Then she rose calmly, crossed to the door, and turned the lock with a quiet click. The sound echoed in my chest like thunder. Emily stiffened. Brian shifted in his chair, suspicion flickering across his face. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Mrs. Foster smiled smoothly. "Of course. We'll just take a little extra care with this transaction." She sat again, her composure steady. But I saw her hand slide discreetly toward the phone beneath her desk. For the first time in months, I felt the balance shift. I was no longer trapped in their script. My note had been heard. My silence had become my loudest voice. Mrs. Foster called me later that afternoon. Her voice was steady, professional, but there was warmth tucked between her words. She told me she had reached out to someone she trusted, an attorney who specialized in elder law. His name was Daniel Morris. I agreed to meet him in the back office of the bank, away from Emily and Brian's watchful eyes. Daniel was younger than I expected, maybe in his 40s. but his handshake was firm, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen families fracture in quiet rooms like this. He listened as I laid out my steno pad, page after page of small notes. He didn't interrupt, just nodded and let me pour months of doubt and fear onto the desk. When I finished, he said simply, "You've done exactly the right thing." He explained how a revocable living trust could shield my assets and how a new durable power of attorney would ensure decisions were mine, not forged under pressure. He also spoke of temporary restraining orders, court freezes, and how banks were legally bound to intervene when abuse was suspected. His calm precision steadied me more than any prayer I'd whispered at night. Meanwhile, Mrs. Voster had already flagged my accounts. She arranged for discreet surveillance in her branch. Every time Emily and Brian brought me in, the cameras recorded Brian's heavy hand on my shoulder, Emily's quick prompts, the way my eyes darted to the floor. Each clip was another brick in the wall of evidence. I left the bank that day with my pad tucked back into my purse, but my fear felt lighter. I wasn't alone anymore. For weeks. Daniel worked quietly behind the scenes. He drafted the trust, filed paperwork, and guided me through each step with patience. At home, Emily's smiles grew tighter, Brian's questions sharper. They sensed resistance but couldn't prove it. I nodded. I smiled. I let them believe I was still pliable. At night, though, I rehearsed the moment I would finally say no out loud. The pieces were falling into place. It didn't take long for the pressure to sharpen. One Friday, Emily breezed in with a folder clutched to her chest. "Good news," she said, setting it down on my table. Inside was a contract for a retirement community I had never heard of. The monthly fee circled in bright ink. "Brian and I already toured it. They have round-the-clock care. You'd love it there." I looked at the glossy photos, manicured lawns, wide porches, strangers laughing under lantern light, and felt my stomach twist. "I haven't agreed to this," I said softly. Brian's voice hardened. "The deposit's already taken care of. We withdrew from the joint account this morning. $25,000. Non-refundable." The words landed like a blow. They had gone ahead without me, carving into my savings as if I were already gone. I steadied my breath, reminding myself that Mrs. Foster had flagged the account, that Daniel was building a case, but the sting of betrayal burned. The calls began next. Emily's voice filled my voicemail with reminders about packing, about how change was for my own good. Brian showed up at my door uninvited, his knock heavy, his presence looming. When I didn't answer, he returned with a local pastor, urging prayer for transition. Even my sister-in-law appeared one evening, wringing her hands, whispering that I should make things easier for everyone. Each knock, each voice, chipped at the walls of my home. Nights stretched long. I found myself sleeping with the hall light on, my steno pad tucked under the pillow, but I didn't falter. Instead, I began moving my valuables, documents, jewelry, photographs, into a fireproof box Daniel had given me. Each item felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. One night, as the wind rattled the windows, I stood at the kitchen sink gripping a cup of tea. I thought of my husband's steady voice, the way he once said, "Dignity is something you protect, even when no one else sees it." I whispered those words to the empty room, promising myself I would not surrender mine. The storm they had stirred was closing in, but so was my answer. The evening I decided to leave, the house felt colder than usual, though the thermostat read 70. Shadows stretched long across the walls, as if the place itself knew it was time to let me go. I packed quietly, slipping a few clothes, my steno pad, and the fireproof box into a canvas bag. I left the television on low, a hum to cover the creak of the floorboards. Emily had called earlier, her tone sharp beneath a layer of sweetness. "Mom, we'll swing by tomorrow to help you start boxing things. It's time." She didn't ask. She informed. I pressed the phone tight against my ear, answered with a vague, "We'll see," and hung up. That was my goodbye. At 9, headlights swept across the curtains. Brian's truck slowed at the curb, lingered, then rolled on. My chest hammered, but I didn't move until the taillights disappeared. When the street fell dark again, I slipped out the back door, locking it behind me. The night air smelled of pine and salt from the coast. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, but once the engine turned over, I felt steadier. I drove to Marjorie's house, a friend from church who had offered her spare room without questions. She hugged me at the door, strong and wordless, and pointed me toward the guest bed. I slept in fits, shoes still on, my bag clutched tight against my chest. At dawn, Daniel called. His voice carried a current of purpose. "We have the temporary restraining order. The accounts are frozen. Today we take the next step." I met him at the courthouse, the papers crisp in my hand. He explained how the order would bar Emily and Brian from touching my finances or harassing me further. By afternoon, Mrs. Foster confirmed every account had been locked under court instruction. That night, in Marjorie's guest room, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker. For the first time in months, I exhaled without fear. The net they had woven so carefully was unraveling. Tomorrow, we would face them on ground of my choosing. Mrs. Foster called me back to the branch the next morning, her tone brisk but reassuring. "Come in," she said. "Bring Daniel with you." My pulse quickened. I knew this would be the moment everything surfaced. When Emily and Brian arrived, they swept into the office with false cheer. Emily kissed my cheek too firmly, whispering, "We'll get this done fast." Brian carried himself like a man claiming territory. He laid his hand on my shoulder, the gesture meant to look protective. I felt it as possession. Mrs. Foster slid the familiar stack of forms across the desk. "Let's review this carefully," she said. Her eyes flicked toward me, steady, a signal that the stage was set. Daniel entered then, carrying a slim folder. Emily's smile faltered. "Who's this?" she asked, voice too high. "My attorney," I said, letting the words land heavy. Before they could respond, 2 uniformed officers stepped into the room. Brian's face drained. Emily's hands twisted in her lap. Mrs. Foster pressed a button, and the screen on the wall lit up with video clips. Me sitting stiff in the lobby, Brian's grip on my shoulder, Emily leaning close with rehearsed lines, the evidence unspooled silently, frame by frame. Daniel opened his folder and read the court order aloud. "All accounts in question are hereby frozen. Any attempt to access them will be considered contempt of court." His voice was firm, unyielding. Brian sputtered. "This is ridiculous." Emily began to cry, tears streaking the makeup she had applied too carefully. I kept my eyes on the paper in front of me, my hands resting steady on the desk. Finally, I spoke. "This is not your ATM. This is my life, and it's mine to decide what happens to it." Silence filled the office. The officers remained still, the court seal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest lifted. The trap they had set had closed on them instead. When we walked out of the bank, Daniel at my side, the autumn air smelled sharper, cleaner. I felt taller somehow, as if reclaiming not just my money but the ground beneath my feet. The house felt different when I returned. The same curtains hung in the windows, the same ticking clock marked the hours, yet the air no longer carried the weight of dread. I walked from room to room touching the furniture, the framed photographs, the worn banister my husband once polished with his own hands, Everything was still mine, not because of papers or court orders, but because I had defended it. Within days, Daniel finalized the trust. Every account, every piece of property shifted under my name alone, secured by law that Emily and Brian could no longer bend. The new document sat neatly in a fireproof safe. When I turned the key, I felt as though I had locked away not only money but fear itself. Life began to soften again. Marjorie invited me back to book club, where the scent of cinnamon coffee and the murmur of pages reminded me of ordinary joys. In the church garden, I knelt beside a row of roses, pruning carefully, the earth cool and forgiving beneath my gloves. People stopped me after service to say they had heard whispers of what happened, and more than one leaned in close to confess their own stories of children pressing too hard, of trust betrayed behind closed doors. I realized I was not alone. Not at all. One afternoon, Mrs. Foster met me for tea. She said, "Your note reminded me why we do this work. Not every cry for help is so brave." Her eyes shone as she lifted her cup. Gratitude welled in me so strong I had to look away. Evenings became gentler. I sat on the porch with a blanket over my lap, watching the maple leaves fall in slow spirals. I no longer jumped at every knock or shadow. My home had turned from a battleground back into a sanctuary. Yet inside that peace was a scar, a reminder carved deep. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark. I carried it not as a burden, but as proof. I had endured, and I had prevailed. Weeks passed before the envelope arrived. It was addressed in Emily's handwriting, the loops of her letters still familiar from school projects she used to tape to the fridge. My hands trembled as I slid it open at the kitchen table. Her words spilled across lined paper. She admitted she had let Brian steer her. That fear of losing him had mattered more than protecting me. She wrote of shame, of nights she couldn't sleep, of watching her own son play in the yard and realizing what she had almost taken from his grandmother. Reading it, I felt anger rise, then ebb, leaving something more complicated. I remembered the little girl who once curled against me during thunderstorms, the teenager who borrowed my scarves, the young mother who asked me to babysit with tired eyes. She was all of those people, and yet also the woman who had stood beside me in the bank, pressing me toward a signature that would have erased me. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into the drawer beneath a candle stub, and whispered, "I can forgive, but I will not forget." Forgiveness was a gift I could offer. Forgetting would be surrender, and I was done surrendering. That night, I sat on the porch as the autumn wind rattled the branches. The house glowed behind me, steady and warm. I thought of my husband's voice, of Daniel's firm counsel, of Mrs. Foster's sharp eyes, of Marjorie's quiet room. And I thought of myself, still here, still whole, still mine. We all leave something behind when the years pile up, but dignity, once defended, stays. And I knew then, with the stars pricking the night sky, that I had defended mine. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.